The shutter snapped. For a breathless second, Henry A. Lott stood frozen behind his tripod, one hand still on the brass lever of the Lancaster instantograph, the other pressed to his chest. The sound echoed faintly across the empty meadow, a thin metallic click swallowed by the wind. Before him, bathed in the honeyed light of early afternoon, stood a single wooden door. It rose from the grass with the assurance of something built to last, its varnish glinting, its latch half open as if someone had only just gone through. But there was nothing behind it. No wall, no frame, just air, and beyond that, a slope of tall grass trembling under the October sun. Lott blinked several times, adjusting his stance as though a change in angle would correct what his eyes insisted was wrong. He rubbed at the lenses of his spectacles and looked again. The door remained, upright, steady, impossible. "What in God's name?" he muttered, the words lost in the breeze. His pulse quickened, not with fear yet, but with that jittery awe that sometimes grips a man who knows he's seeing something he shouldn't. He stepped closer. The grass beneath his boots whispered dryly, the scent of crushed clover rising with each footfall. From here he could see the hinges, 2 of them, iron, weather-worn but intact. A line of nail heads ran cleanly down the sideboard, yet there was no sign of attachment or footing. The base did not sink into the soil, it merely touched it, casting a thin, distinct shadow. He crouched, tracing the line with his eyes. The light fell correctly almost. The grass behind the top panel, however, seemed darker, as though the sunlight there had thickened, bending inward like heat haze reversed. Lott's fingers hovered in the air, trembling. He wanted to touch it, to test its weight, but something in the stillness warned him not to. The meadow was quiet now, the wind having dropped away altogether. Only the faint rattle of his camera's chain against the tripod broke the silence. He swallowed, then reached for his logbook, flipping it open to record his data. 3:12 p.m. Exposure 7 seconds. Boundary marker, peculiar. He hesitated over the last word before underlining it twice. A shadow passed overhead, a lone hawk circling lazily. When Lott looked back to the door, he thought for the briefest instant that it had shifted. The brass latch, which he could have sworn hung downward, now angled slightly to the side. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You're seeing reflections, that's all." Yet the unease rooted deeper. He adjusted the tripod, intent on a second exposure, but his hand refused to steady. The camera's frame wobbled. One leg sank half an inch into the earth. He cursed under his breath, pulled it free, and noticed the metal tip. Blackened. Burned, perhaps. But there were no scorch marks on the grass. He took a step back. The air felt heavier, charged. Somewhere near the fence line, a crow let out a sharp, cracking cry and vanished into the trees. Lott's breath clouded, though the day was not cold. He found himself glancing past the door, expecting to see, what? A person? A building that should have been there? The idea refused to form. He clicked the camera case shut and slung it over his shoulder. "Enough for today," he murmured. "Enough." As he turned to leave, the wind returned, rustling the meadow in waves. The grasses moved, everywhere except within the narrow outline of the door. There, the blades stood perfectly still, frozen mid-motion as though painted. Lott stopped mid-stride, staring. The sun caught the hinge again, flashing gold. Reflexively, he reached for his hat and tipped it lower over his eyes. He did not take another picture. By the time he returned to the dirt road, sweat had soaked through his collar despite the cool air. He glanced once over his shoulder. The door still stood, smaller now in the distance but clear against the green. For a moment he thought he saw the horizon dip slightly behind it, a faint curve, as if the land itself bent inward to meet the frame. He blinked hard, and the illusion vanished. That night, in his workshop, he developed the plate. Under the faint orange glow of the lamp, the image took shape in its bath of developer. First the grass, then the fence, then that solitary rectangle of wood and darkness. He leaned closer. The hinge caught the light exactly as he remembered, yet the sky behind it seemed off, richer somehow. The blue deepened into something almost metallic. He adjusted the magnifier and froze. The grass directly behind the top panel appeared blurred, as though caught in motion, though he knew the wind had been still. It was as if two horizons had overlapped imperfectly, one misaligned with the other. Lott sat back, heart pounding. His hands trembled so violently that drops of developer spattered across the table. "The hinge caught the sun," he whispered, though there was no hinge to catch it. He laughed once, short and dry, then clamped a hand over his mouth. In the stillness of his studio, the words seemed to echo back at him. He placed the wet plate carefully in its rack and wiped his palms on his apron. The feeling of wrongness lingered, thick, electric. He could not bring himself to make a print that night. Instead, he locked the negatives in a small wooden box and bolted the door to his workroom. Outside, the wind rose again, whistling faintly through the shutters like a breath drawn across hollow wood. When he finally extinguished the lamp and climbed the stairs to his room, he paused at the window. Down across the fields, beneath the pale smear of moonlight, the meadow stretched silent and silver. He could not see the door from this distance. Still, he imagined it standing there, alone, indifferent, waiting. The image burned behind his eyes until sleep took him, restless and shallow. In the morning, when his apprentice arrived to fetch equipment, he found the tripod still planted in the field, one leg charred at the tip. The grass around it was cool, untouched by flame. By noon, Henry A. Lott had already sealed the negatives and filed them under Agrarian Outbuildings, Lot 17. He did not mention the door again, but every few minutes he would stop what he was doing, glance toward the window, and listen, half expecting to hear the soft creak of a hinge turning in the wind. This photograph should not exist. The moment Henry Lott stepped back from the camera tripod, the autumn wind died as though it had been listening. He squinted through the dim brass viewfinder one last time, feeling the crisp air settle against his neck. The pasture stretched before him, quiet, unbroken, washed in the pale gold of late afternoon. Yet his pulse thudded with unease. He had taken 2 plates already, one of the barn, one of the fence, but this third image, this strange, upright door standing alone in the grass, had made his fingers tremble on the shutter. He waited, counting the seconds in his head as the exposure finished. When the lens snapped shut, he felt something shift in the air around him, as if a breath had been drawn and not released. Lott straightened, his boots crunching on dry stalks. The door stood 20 paces ahead, full-sized, varnished faintly, its brass hinge catching the dying light. No post supported it, no foundation held it upright. The thing simply was. He packed the camera with mechanical precision, but his gaze kept drifting back to the meadow. It was wrong. Too still, too bright, as though the light bent around the edges of that wooden frame. When he turned to leave, he thought he heard a faint knock, 3 soft taps echoing behind him. He froze, listening. Only the wind answered. By the time he trudged back to his wagon, his mind felt clouded, half dreaming. He jotted his notes into his logbook with stiff fingers. 3:12 p.m. Boundary marker, peculiar. The word looked ridiculous on the page, but he couldn't bring himself to cross it out. That evening, under the amber glow of the lantern in his small rented room, Lott developed the plates in silence. The first 2 exposures, clear, ordinary, as expected. The third, he paused. The image of the door shimmered faintly as it appeared on the glass. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the plate. The latch gleamed like a live ember. Behind it, the meadow darkened unnaturally, as though the sunlight bent inward, collapsing into itself. He whispered to no one. The hinge caught the sun, though there was no hinge to catch it. The next morning, townspeople saw him crossing the main street toward Dr. Emmett Ryle's office. His face was pale, his hat crooked, eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. Ryle, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed beard, opened his door to find Lott standing rigid in the threshold. "You look as if you've seen a ghost, Henry," Ryle said, motioning him inside. "It's the field," Lott replied quietly, his voice shaking. "The meadow, past the stone fence near Lot 17. There's a door, standing upright. I photographed it." Ryle frowned, pulling out a chair. "A door? To what?" "That's the trouble," Lott muttered, running a trembling hand through his hair. "To nothing. But it shouldn't be there, and yet it was." Ryle studied him closely. The man's skin was clammy, his pupils wide. He noted it in his ledger later. Lott appears unsteady, distracted, keeps glancing at air as though following a draft no one else can feel. When Lott left the office, he walked slowly toward the outskirts of town, as if drawn by an invisible tether. The wind had picked up again, carrying dry leaves across the path. Every time he looked toward the hills, he thought he saw movement, a faint shimmer in the grass, like heat rising though the air was cold. That evening, in the parish hall, the bell ringer, Thomas Hale, spoke nervously to Reverend Corbin. "Something's been knocking out by the western pasture," he said. "3 knocks, steady, like someone rapping on wood." Corbin smiled indulgently, dismissing it as boys playing tricks or the sound of shifting branches. But Hale swore there were no trees in that field, only grass and stone. Over the following nights, several townsfolk mentioned hearing it too, the low, hollow rhythm echoing faintly through the wind. None dared to investigate after dark. Dalmer's Hollow was known for its mists and unpredictable drafts that carried sound strangely. The explanation was simple enough, yet Ryle's note about Lott's demeanor, his wide-eyed stares, his sudden flinches at invisible movement, cast an uneasy shadow over the village. On the 3rd day, Lott returned to the pasture, intending to prove to himself it had been a trick of light. The grass moved softly in the wind. The horizon glowed under a pale sun. But where the door had stood, there was only a faint outline in the earth, a rectangle of darker soil untouched by frost. He set his hand above it, and though the breeze was mild, he felt cold radiating upward. His chest tightened. He backed away and left the camera untouched. That night, he locked his negatives in a steel case and delivered them to the county clerk, insisting they be stored under official record. The clerk, puzzled but obliging, catalogued them under agrarian outbuildings. Lot 17. Weeks passed. The parish reports continued. Phantom knocks near the western pasture, strange drafts that passed through closed rooms. Locals chalked it up to harvest winds. Yet those who walked that way claimed their compasses twitched and the air thickened briefly before clearing again. At the Dalmer County office, the plate remained sealed beneath glass. Only once did a clerk open the drawer to confirm its number. The faint smell of varnish drifted out. By early winter, Lott had stopped surveying altogether. He moved inland, taking smaller contracts, avoiding any mention of Lot 17. In his logbook, the final entry before his resignation was one sentence. The wind moves through the same space twice. Years later, long after Lott's death when the archives were reorganized, a young clerk would read the physician's note aloud, Ryle's record of that trembling man glancing at air, and remark how absurd it sounded. But when the glass plate was examined again decades later, the absurdity would vanish. For all the dismissals, the scientific doubts, and the rural superstition, the photograph remained undeniable. The door, by every physical measure, stood where nothing had ever been built. The wind shifted once, then stilled. Henry Lott adjusted the focus ring on his Lancaster camera, the polished brass edges glinting faintly under the autumn sun. He had already taken 2 exposures that afternoon, the north barn and the boundary fence, but it was the third subject that held him still. A rectangular shape, upright against the sloping field, drew his eye like a magnet. From a distance it seemed an old gate or fragment of a wall, but as he approached it became clear that it was neither. A door, complete, varnished, its iron hinges catching light, stood perfectly upright in the middle of the meadow, unconnected to anything at all. He stopped a few feet away, boots sinking slightly into the damp grass. The breeze pressed softly against his coat, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant soil. Lott tilted his head, scanning for any frame, rope, or support that could explain its balance. There was nothing. The door simply stood, its brass latch gleaming, its lower edge buried a fraction into the grass as though the ground itself held it steady. His hand tightened around the camera strap. Boundary marker. Peculiar, he murmured under his breath, repeating the phrase he had just written into his survey log. His voice sounded smaller than usual, swallowed by the vast quiet of the field. He set the tripod, one leg sinking slightly into the earth, and steadied the lens toward the door. Through the ground glass, the image appeared sharper than expected. Too sharp. The air around the door seemed to shimmer, distorting faintly as though viewed through water. He blinked, wiped the lens, and looked again. The shimmer remained. A faint pull stirred in his chest, something between fascination and unease. Still, professionalism guided his hands. He adjusted the aperture, timed the light, and opened the shutter for a 7-second exposure. The instant the shutter closed, a bright glint flashed across the hinge, an impossible spark that made him flinch backward. There was no fire, no reflection he could trace, just a clean metallic flicker that vanished as soon as he saw it. He lowered the camera slowly, eyes fixed on the hinge. The hinge caught the sun, he whispered, heart pounding, though there was no hinge to catch it. He packed his camera, feeling the weight of silence press closer. Even the birds had gone still. The door did not move. It cast a thin, upright shadow across the field, but when he circled around to study it from the opposite side, the shadow shifted unnaturally, bending slightly toward the light instead of away from it. By the time he left the pasture, the air behind him felt colder, as though the field exhaled something unseen. He walked quickly back toward the road, telling himself it was a trick of the light, a structural illusion, nothing more. Yet when he reached the edge of the property, he found himself looking back, just once. The door still stood there, perfectly still, its latch glinting like an eye. That night he developed the plates in the dim back room of his small cabin. The smell of chemicals filled the air, sharp and metallic. As the final plate emerged from the tray, Lott froze. The barn exposure looked ordinary. The fence, clear and crisp, but the third image stopped his breath. The door appeared exactly as he had seen it, but behind its upper panel, the light bent inward, warping the meadow's horizon as though the ground curved toward some invisible center. He leaned closer, pulse hammering in his throat. The distortion was unmistakable, real, physical. He checked the edges for double exposure, scanning for any overlap or chemical flaw, but the plate was clean. Every detail was perfect, which made the impossibility even sharper. He stared at it for what felt like hours. Once he thought he heard a faint creak, the dry whine of a hinge shifting in air, but there was no movement in the room. His lamp flame flickered briefly, then steadied. He exhaled and set the plate aside, hands trembling slightly. "It's just a door," he said aloud, though the words carried little conviction. When dawn came, Lott decided not to return to the field. He told himself he had work elsewhere, that the survey could wait. Yet, as he brewed his morning coffee, his gaze kept drifting to the window, to the open country beyond the ridge. Every time the wind stirred, he imagined the faint outline of that solitary door swaying against the grass. By noon, his apprentice, Thomas Wren, grew concerned. "You all right, sir?" he asked, stepping into the workshop. Lott barely looked up from his ledger. "Yes," he said quickly. "Just a peculiar exposure, that's all." The boy hesitated. "You've written the same line 3 times, he said softly, pointing to the page where Lott's pen had traced the same phrase over and over. Frame upright, no base. Lott's hand froze above the ink. He tore out the page, folded it carefully, and locked it in his field box without another word. That evening, Thomas ventured out alone to the pasture, curious about what had unsettled his mentor. The sun had begun to sink behind the hills, painting the field in pale gold. The grass rippled gently, ordinary in every way. But in the center of the meadow, the tripod still stood, one leg half buried, another faintly blackened at the tip as if touched by heat. Thomas knelt, running his fingers along the scorched wood. It was warm. He looked around for a campfire, for lightning, for any sign of burning, but the grass around the mark was untouched, cool beneath his hand. He straightened slowly, unease crawling up his spine. The air smelled faintly of varnish and iron. Something unseen pressed against his ears, a pressure like the hush before a storm. Without understanding why, he folded the tripod and hurried back toward town, not daring to look over his shoulder. When he returned, Lott was waiting by the door, pale and silent. "Where did you go?" he asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, then told him what he'd seen: the scorched leg, the warmth, the silence. Lott's expression tightened. "Lock the negatives," he said finally, voice low. "All of them." Tonight, by nightfall, the plates and prints were sealed inside a wooden case and delivered to the Dalmer County Hall of Records. Lott signed the log with an unsteady hand, refusing to explain the urgency. As he turned to leave, the clerk called after him. "You want me to make more prints?" Lott paused in the doorway, the corridor light falling across his tired face. "No," he said after a moment. "Only one print was ever made." The shimmer appeared first. Not bright, not immediate, just a faint wavering in the air above the plate like heat rising from stone. Professor Lionel Greaves leaned closer, one hand steadying the edge of the table, the other turning the brass knob of the interferometer a fraction to the left. The mercury vapor lamp hissed behind him, its cold blue light cutting across the workshop. He whispered to his assistant, "Hold it steady. There, do you see the lines bending?" The young man nodded, swallowing hard. The twin bands of light that should have run parallel now curved inward around the image of the door, as if drawn toward an invisible center. Greaves adjusted the aperture again. Breath held. The air inside the laboratory seemed thicker. "Refraction through nothing," he muttered, astonishment masking the tremor in his voice. For a moment he thought the lamp was flickering, but it was not the lamp. The distortion came from the plate itself, the meadow rippling softly, blades of grass appearing to sway in a wind that had long since died. When the reading needle on the interferometer leapt twice and settled, Greaves stepped back, notebook trembling in his grasp. "Parallel wave interference, without medium," he wrote, the ink blotting at the end of the line. He could not bring himself to write the rest, that what he had measured should only occur through glass or water, never through air. By the end of the week, his letter reached Elias Barrand at the Metropolitan Museum of Applied Photography. Barrand replied with haste, "Bring the plate to me." This deserves a second examination. And so, on a cold morning in February 1910, Greaves arrived in New York with the artifact locked in a padded crate. The museum's basement darkroom was colder than expected, its walls lined with tin sheets to prevent stray reflection. Barrand, a tall man with a surgeon's patience, watched in silence as the plate was unboxed under the red glow of a safety lamp. "Strange," Barrand murmured, brushing his gloved fingers along the edge of the glass. "No sign of damage. Yet the hinge shadow runs toward the source. Impossible optics." Greaves forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I verified it 3 times. It's not a reversal error." Barrand turned the plate slightly, his expression sharpening. The grass bends away from the doorframe. As if the field itself were bowing, neither man spoke for a long moment. Only the low hum of the lamp filled the room. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Barrand said, "Would you stand in that field if it still existed?" Greaves hesitated. I'm not certain I could find it again. But yes, I would. 2 months later, he did. Guided by the coordinates in Lott's original ledger, Baran traveled to Vermont alone. The pasture lay silent, the stone fence half collapsed, the air heavy with early spring damp. He knelt where the door had once stood, feeling the wind shift strangely as if turning corners that weren't there. His field journal, later discovered among his papers, recorded a single line. "The grass here resists the wind." When Baran returned to New York, his demeanor had changed. He wrote to Greaves in a sealed envelope that remained unread by others for decades. "I have stood in that field," he confessed. "There is no foundation. Yet the grass under the frame resists the wind." The ink trailed off mid-sentence as though his pen had faltered at the thought. Weeks later, Greaves resumed his experiments, determined to reproduce the phenomenon under controlled conditions. In the dim laboratory, he placed the plate inside a glass-walled cabinet and switched on the mercury lamp once more. The assistant stood beside him, notebook ready. "We'll measure spectral displacement this time," Greaves said, voice steady but heart quickening. As the bluish light bathed the cabinet, a faint shimmer formed along the negative's left margin, gentle at first, then tightening into a pulsing halo. "Do you hear that?" the assistant asked. A low vibration hummed through the wood of the table, subtle yet insistent, like a tuning fork held against the bone. Greaves leaned closer. "Record the duration." The assistant's watch ticked loudly in the silence. 11 seconds. Then the sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The air seemed to sigh. Greaves exhaled and stepped back, realizing his own pulse matched the rhythm of the hum. "It repeats only when no one speaks," he said softly. The assistant looked at him, puzzled. "Sir?" He turned toward the door. "Next time, say nothing. Let it happen." That night, alone in the dark room, Greaves replayed the events in his mind. The shimmer, the pull of air, the sound that came from silence. He could not shake the feeling that the door in the image was less an object than a condition, a standing remainder of something unseen. He wrote a final note before locking the plate away. If sound itself invites the disturbance, then perhaps the space within the frame listens. The experiments were suspended after that. Officially, the museum labeled the artifact Anomalous Perspective Study Number, 42 inches, and stored it under restricted access. But those who handled the cabinet afterward, curators, technicians, night custodians, spoke quietly of a vibration that came and went when the room fell silent, as if the photograph remembered being observed. And though no one could ever prove it, one rumor persisted among the staff for years, that the faint humming always lasted the same length of time. The phenomenon replicated itself only when no one was speaking. The first theory appeared on a cold spring morning in 1892, when Professor Lionel Greaves stood before a crowded lecture hall at Ardenbrook College and declared, "Lott's photograph is nothing but a double exposure." His voice echoed sharply against the wooden panels, confident yet defensive. He presented enlarged projections of the plate, pointing at the faint overlapping grains near the latch. "Observe the inconsistency here. 2 exposures, 1 misaligned. The door was never real." His students nodded, but their expressions betrayed unease. Something about the image, its stillness, its perfect symmetry, defied the simplicity of error. Weeks later, in the dim back room of the county archive, technician Edwin Pike examined the original plate under magnification. His lamp glowed faintly against the glass, revealing the grain of the emulsion in minute detail. "No layering," he murmured, running a gloved fingertip along the surface. "No chemical bleed, no overlap." He recorded the observation in the margin of Greaves's lecture pamphlet and underlined one phrase 3 times. "Optically sound." When he lifted his head, the reflection of the door seemed to quiver on the lens of his spectacles, though the room was perfectly still. Pike blinked hard and turned away, telling himself it was only the lamplight. The second theory was less forgiving. It came from the procedural skeptics, the men of the land office who saw deception in every anomaly. They accused Henry Lott of staging the scene, of planting a freestanding door in the meadow to exaggerate the land's features and claim extra survey pay. "He could have nailed it into the soil," one inspector insisted, pacing before a map. A prank or a fraud for attention. But when they combed Dalmer's Hollow for the supposed prop, they found nothing. No matching timber. No fresh carpentry marks. The mill ledger contained no record of new lumber sales to Lott or his assistants. Even the carpenter in the next town swore he hadn't cut a door of that size in years. One autumn afternoon, Inspector Hale visited the field himself. The grass was high and golden, bending slightly where the frame had once stood. He pressed his boot into the soil and felt a subtle chill, as though the ground remembered something missing. He glanced around. Empty horizon. No fence, no shed. "Then where the devil did he get it from?" he muttered. His words carried on the wind, swallowed by the silence. He left that night unsettled, the sound of his footsteps oddly muffled as he crossed the pasture. By the early 1900s, a third explanation began to spread beyond the scientific circles. It came from Merrick Dowell, an antiquarian and lecturer of metaphysical architecture. Dowell spoke in dim parlors and candlelit reading rooms, his tone slow and persuasive. "We call it a spatial remainder," he told his listeners, holding up a reproduction of the photograph. "An aperture left behind when a structure is erased not by time, but by displacement." His audience listened in rapt silence as he traced the faint curvature of the horizon behind the door with his finger. "Notice how the light bends inward, as if space itself recoiled." Dowell's fascination soon turned into obsession. He traveled to Dalmer's Hollow in 1911, arriving by horse cart under a gray sky. The field was quiet, wet with dew. He carried with him a brass compass, a folding ruler, and a copy of Lott's logbook borrowed from the archives. Standing where the tripod had once been found, he drove a small wooden marker into the soil and watched the compass needle twitch, not northward, but slightly west, then still. "Residual architecture," he whispered, "the outline of what should no longer exist." That night, at the inn, Dowell filled his notebook with calculations and sketches of door frames intersecting planes of distorted perspective. The ink smeared under his hand as he wrote, the lantern light flickering low. If the door stood where no house was built, he reasoned, then perhaps the house was not destroyed. It simply did not belong to this world. He paused, staring out the window at the darkness beyond the fields. The horizon seemed too level, too calm, as if waiting for something unseen to return. When Dowell presented his findings to the Philosophical Society of New England, laughter filled the hall. "A doorway to another plane?" scoffed Greaves, now older, his beard silvered with age. "Sir, your ghost stories insult the discipline." Dowell met his gaze coolly. "Then explain why the grass behind the frame was pressed outward, as if by a breeze that came from nowhere." For a moment the room fell quiet. Even Greaves hesitated before replying. "Coincidence," he said, but his voice had lost conviction. The debate stretched across decades, surviving wars and generations. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny, the double exposure disproved by physics, the hoax unsupported by evidence, the metaphysical idea dismissed by academia, yet never entirely forgotten. The door remained singular, a contradiction carved into glass, immune to explanation. In every retelling, one detail returned unchanged, the shadow that bent the wrong way, darker at its edges, as if hinting at something behind the photograph itself. No witness, camera, or survey afterward ever captured that door, or any trace of it, again. What stood there vanished without being removed. The moment the humidity alarm tripped, Ruth Meldon felt it through the soles of her shoes before she heard it. The vibration came like a faint shiver through the tiled floor of the Dalmer County Archives sub-basement, followed by a steady tone that broke the stillness of the early morning. She had been cataloging paper indexes in the adjoining office, half asleep and surrounded by the metallic scent of preservation chemicals. The clock read 3:14 a.m. when she stepped into the corridor, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The vault door stood ajar. No one else was scheduled for inspection until the following week. Ruth hesitated, glancing down the narrow passage lined with cold iron shelving, each cabinet marked by decade and region. A soft hum, like wind passing through a hollow tube, echoed faintly from within. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. Inside, the air was heavy, colder than the hall, almost metallic on the tongue. Her breath fogged as she crossed to the inspection desk where the sealed storage box sat, its label written in fading ink. Lott, 17. Exposure, 1891. She had read the brief file earlier that month while updating the catalog index. The box was supposed to remain sealed after a prior report of visual irregularities. Yet the humidity alert had forced her to act. Mold, if left unchecked, could destroy a century-old glass plate overnight. Her gloved hands brushed the lid. The tape cracked as she peeled it back, releasing a faint scent, varnish and oak, strangely fresh despite the decades. She frowned, noting that the interior padding was dry, untouched by moisture. "Just a chemical reaction," she murmured to herself, though her voice sounded smaller than she intended. When she lifted the plate free, the overhead light flickered once. The glass was cool, too cool. Beneath the flashlight's beam, the image revealed the familiar scene: the meadow, the low stone fence, the solitary door standing in the grass. But as she tilted the plate slightly, a shimmer rippled across its surface, distorting the horizon behind the door's upper panels. It almost seemed to move, like heat bending air. She blinked and adjusted her glasses. For a moment, she thought she saw the door ajar, only a fraction, but enough for a line of shadow to appear between the frame and latch. No, that's just reflection," she whispered. Her voice quavered. The temperature monitor beside the desk began to tick. Ruth turned toward it just as the needle dropped 6 degrees. Then came a subtle creak, soft, deliberate, like a hinge under strain. She froze. The sound hadn't come from the speakers or the pipes above. It came from behind her. She turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the room. The beam fell over rows of cabinets, sealed boxes, and the locked vault door. Nothing moved, but the air felt charged, tense, like the second before a thunderclap. She took a step back, heart pounding, her shoes echoing faintly on the tiles. The bulb overhead flickered again, once, twice, then steadied. In that momentary flash, the reflection on the cabinet glass caught her eye. She saw herself, pale and trembling, standing beside the inspection desk. But behind her reflection, faint and misaligned, stood something else, a darker rectangle, upright and vertical, where no object should be. Ruth spun around. The space was empty. The hum deepened. Her breath came shallow and quick. She set the plate down, but the edges of the image still seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to her movement. "It's only condensation," she told herself, but her throat was dry. She took a slow step backward, then another. Then, from somewhere deep within the vault, far beyond the light's reach, came the sound again. A hinge turning, slow and cautious. Ruth's voice cracked into the silence. "Who's there?" The hum stopped. Every tick of the temperature gauge froze mid-swing. She strained to listen, but the silence pressed back at her, thick and unmoving. Then, very faintly, she heard it. A breath, almost human, drawn between two boards. Her composure broke. She grabbed her flashlight and stumbled toward the door, slamming her shoulder into the metal frame. The vault latch clanged shut behind her. For several seconds, she leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, gasping for air. By the time the morning staff arrived, Ruth had sealed the plate back into its container and marked the logbook, "Anomalous, do not reopen." She filed the incident report under routine environmental control, omitting every detail of the sound, the temperature drop, the reflection. She told herself it was exhaustion, imagination fed by midnight silence. But she never entered the archive vault again. Months later, during a transfer of artifacts to the Brimwell Annex, the sealed box went missing. The shipping manifest listed it, yet the receiving inventory did not. No one questioned the loss. Clerical errors were common. Still, Ruth noticed that whenever she passed through the hall near the old vault, the air felt subtly colder, especially in a narrow rectangle near the floor tiles. Years passed. The archive's basement was converted into storage for municipal records, its humidity system dismantled. Then, in 2008, a photograph appeared briefly on a small online forum devoted to antique photography. It was labeled "Unknown Exposure, Vermont, 1891. The image was unmistakable: the meadow, the fence, and the door. Frame 27 of the scan showed something strange. The horizon curved inward, distorting the grass and sky as if bending around a center point. Comments flooded in, questioning the authenticity, but the post vanished within hours, flagged for metadata corruption. The uploader's account was deleted. Ruth Meldon had long since retired, but when shown a printed copy of the scan by a former colleague, she refused to look at it directly. "It was never a photograph," she said quietly. "It was an opening, pretending to be one." To this day, the site of the old pasture remains fenced off, though nothing visible marks the spot. Those who walk through Dalmer's Hollow still report a subtle chill there, a narrow corridor of air colder than the rest of the field, shaped like a door no one ever built. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.